The night air in Brooklyn often carried the sound of sirens, the rattle of trains, and the faint hum of a city that never seemed to rest. For Destiny Williams, those sounds were the rhythm of survival, each note a reminder that life pressed on whether or not you were ready. She had grown up believing that if she worked hard enough, if she kept her head high and her spirit unbroken, she could carve out a brighter future for herself and for the people she loved most. That dream kept her running every morning, sneakers pounding the cracked sidewalks, breath misting in the cold dawn. She would pass by shuttered stores, graffitied walls, and the old brownstones that leaned against each other like tired men. And each time she whispered a silent vow, "I won't give up. Not ever." But life has a way of rewriting dreams without asking permission. Destiny's father, once the anchor of their small family, collapsed on a bitter winter evening. A stroke, sudden and merciless, stole him away in the space of a heartbeat. She had watched him being carried out on a stretcher, the flashing red lights painting her family's faces in streaks of fear. He never came back home. From that day, the weight of survival fell on her young shoulders, pressing down harder than she ever imagined. Her mother, once a strong woman with hands roughened by long shifts at a factory, began to fade under the strain. The cough started quietly, tucked into the corners of the night, but soon became constant, each one racking her frame and stealing the air from her lungs. The doctors spoke of medical bills and treatments Destiny could never afford, their voices flat and indifferent as if they were discussing numbers on a page rather than the woman who had raised her. Her little brother, Isaiah, barely 16, was full of promise. His teachers said he had the mind for college, a rare gift, but tuition notices are rived like threats, cold, sharp reminders that poverty could erase even the brightest future. Destiny wanted more than anything to keep her own dream alive. She had once imagined herself standing in a classroom as the first in her family to graduate, perhaps wearing a cap and gown, her mother clapping through tears of joy. She used to spend evenings curled over library books, sketching out a life where success was earned by grit and perseverance. But dreams do not fill empty stomachs, nor do they pay for rent when the landlord comes knocking. One by one, those visions were folded away, tucked deep into the corners of her heart. She traded textbooks for aprons, lectures for late-night shifts, and ambitions for survival. The city became her battlefield. She fried burgers in fast food kitchens where the grease never seemed to wash off her skin. She swept stairwells in old tenements, carrying buckets heavy enough to bend her back. She balanced trays in upscale cafes where wealthy couples barely looked her way except to complain. And she cleaned the homes of strangers, scrubbing floors so spotless they reflected her tired face back at her. Every dollar earned was a lifeline, stretched thin between rent, medicine, and the hope of keeping Isaiah in school. Her hands cracked from detergent, her shoulders ached from long nights, but she bore it all with quiet resolve. Sometimes late at night, when the world had gone still, Destiny would sit by the tiny window of her apartment, staring out at the stars peeking faintly through the haze of the city. Those stars seemed so far away, unreachable, yet they reminded her that light still existed somewhere beyond the darkness. In those moments, tears she tried so hard to hide would finally slip down her cheeks. She would press her forehead against the cool glass and whisper the promises she had once made to herself. One day, things will be different. One day, we'll rise from this. Though the world around her seemed determined to crush her, a flame still burned within Destiny Williams. Small, fragile, flickering against the winds of hardship, but alive. That flame was her refusal to surrender, the stubborn belief that hope, even when buried beneath debt, grief, and exhaustion, could not be extinguished. She carried it with her through every long shift, every bill slipped under the door, every quiet cry she muffled into her pillow. And she never knew that this very flame, the one she thought too small to matter, was about to set in motion a miracle no one in her world could have predicted. For somewhere far from her worn apartment and weary steps, a child who had never walked and a father who had never healed were waiting for the spark only she could bring. The knock came on a late autumn afternoon when the sky sagged heavy with gray, and the chill of the season slid through the thin cracks of Destiny's apartment windows. She was hunched over the kitchen table, sorting through bills with trembling hands, her lips pressed into a tight line. Every envelope screamed urgent, and every number inside felt like another mountain she could never climb. Her mother lay on the couch, coughing softly into a handkerchief, while Isaiah sat at the counter, scribbling through his homework, pretending not to notice the tension thickening the room. The knock startled her. Few people ever came by. She wiped her damp palms against her apron and opened the door. It was Mrs. Ruth, the elderly woman from down the hall who always smelled faintly of lavender soap and carried herself with quiet dignity, despite her wrinkled hands and bent back. Destiny had helped her many times, carrying groceries up the stairs, sitting with her when her arthritis flared, even running errands on days the old woman could barely move. "Destiny, dear," Mrs. Ruth said, her voice both kind and urgent. "I know you've been carrying far too much. I might have something, not perfect, but better than what you've got now." Destiny blinked, clutching the doorframe. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Ruth leaned closer, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. "There's a wealthy family on the Upper West Side. They're looking for a live-in housekeeper, someone who can also help with the child. It pays well, room, board, and a steady income. I could put in a word for you." Destiny's chest tightened. The words live-in stuck to her like cold rain. "A live-in?" "Yes," Mrs. Ruth said softly, studying her face. "But hear me out. Their boy, he's different. He hasn't spoken or walked since his mother passed. They say no doctor has been able to reach him. The father," she paused as if weighing how much to reveal. "He's difficult, but the grandmother swears they just need someone kind, someone patient. Destiny, I thought of you instantly." For a moment, the kitchen behind her blurred. She thought of her mother's cough, of Isaiah's hopeful eyes fixed on a future that seemed to slip further each day. She thought of the stack of bills on the table, their red lettering like claws at her throat. The job wasn't what she dreamed of. It wasn't classrooms and college lectures, but maybe dreams had to wait when reality was this heavy. She swallowed hard. When would they want me to start? Mrs. Ruth reached out and squeezed her hand. "Tomorrow, if you say yes." Destiny hesitated. 1,000 doubts rushed in. Could she really leave her mother and Isaiah? Could she serve strangers who lived in a world of polished marble and perfection, when she still carried the grit of Brooklyn under her nails? Would they even accept her, a black girl from the other side of the city, with nothing but determination to her name? Her mother's voice broke through her storm of thoughts. "Destiny? Who is it?" She turned to see her mother sitting up weakly, eyes tired, but curious. Destiny forced a small smile. "It's Mrs. Ruth. She knows about a job." Her mother coughed, then leaned forward, her gaze sharp despite her frailty. "Take it, child. Don't waste time thinking you aren't enough. You've carried this family on your back for too long. If it gives us even one breath of relief, you must take it." Isaiah's pencil stilled. He looked at his sister, his voice small but steady. "If you go, I'll keep things here together. Don't worry about me. Just promise me you won't give up on yourself." Tears pricked Destiny's eyes, but she blinked them away. She had no luxury for weakness. She nodded to Mrs. Ruth. "Tell them I'll be there." The next morning came cold and sharp. Destiny pulled on her threadbare coat, patched at the elbows, and packed a simple lunch into her faded tote. She kissed her mother's forehead, hugged Isaiah tight, and whispered, "Be strong. I'll be back as soon as I can." Then she stepped out into the biting wind, her heart pounding with a mix of dread and determination. The subway ride carried her farther and farther from the world she knew. Graffiti-scarred walls gave way to gleaming towers. Corner bodegas turned into boutique cafes. She pressed her forehead against the glass, watching the city change as if she were crossing not just distance, but an invisible line between two universes. When the train hissed to a stop, she stepped out into a street lined with golden trees and polished cars that reflected the morning sun like mirrors. Before her rose a building so tall it seemed to pierce the clouds, guarded by uniformed doormen whose eyes swept over her as if weighing her worth. Destiny clutched her tote tighter and whispered under her breath, "For Mama, for Isaiah, I can do this." Her footsteps echoed on the marble floor of the lobby as she approached the elevator, every beat of her heart louder than the last. She did not yet know that beyond those polished doors lay a life so different from hers. It would change everything she thought she knew about love, pain, and miracles. And as the elevator doors slid shut, she felt it, the sense that her story, shaped by ashes and struggle, was about to collide with a silence deeper than her own. A silence waiting to be broken. The elevator doors opened with a low chime, spilling Destiny into a world that felt more like a museum than a home. The penthouse stretched wide before her, marble floors polished to a mirror's shine, crystal chandeliers dripping golden light, and walls lined with paintings that seemed too perfect, too staged to belong to real people. Her scuffed shoes squeaked faintly as she stepped inside, her reflection trailing her like an unwelcome guest. A woman with silver hair and eyes as sharp as glass appeared at the end of the corridor. She was graceful, her movements precise, her tailored suit understated yet commanding. Destiny instantly recognized her as the grandmother, Mrs. Lorraine Blake, the one who had summoned her. "You must be Destiny," Lorraine said with a polite smile, though her gaze seemed to take in everything. Destiny's worn coat, the calloused hands, even the nervous quiver in her step. "Come, he's waiting." Destiny followed her down the hallway. The silence was unnerving, as though the entire penthouse held its breath. No laughter, no chatter, no signs of a child living here. Just the hum of distant air vents and the hollow click of their footsteps. Lorraine stopped in front of a door painted soft gray. She turned, her voice lowering. "Before you go in, you need to understand. Samuel, he hasn't spoken since his mother died, and he hasn't walked either. Doctors say there's nothing physically wrong, but grief has its own chains. My son, Matthew, believes routine will fix him. I disagree. The boy needs something more. He needs warmth. That's why you're here." Her hand lingered on the doorknob as if even she feared the quiet behind it. Then she pushed the door open and Destiny stepped inside. The room was beautiful. Sunlight poured through tall windows draped with sheer curtains, illuminating shelves filled with untouched toys, storybooks arranged in perfect rows, and a small easel with a box of unopened crayons beside it. It should have been a child's paradise, but the air was heavy, still, like a church where no prayers had been answered. In the corner, on a pale rug, sat a boy, Samuel. He was smaller than Destiny expected, his blonde hair falling over a pale forehead, his body swallowed by an oversized navy sweater. His legs were tucked beneath him, unmoving, and in his arms he clutched a worn stuffed bunny, its ears threadbare from too much holding. His gray eyes, eerily similar to the cold ones Destiny had glimpsed in Matthew's portrait on the wall, stared out the window as though chasing something far away. Destiny froze. She felt her chest tighten at the sight of him. There was no sound, no flicker of acknowledgement that he even knew she was there. Just silence, stretching so thick it felt like a wall. She crouched slowly, careful not to startle him, and set her toad on the floor. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pulled out an old fairy tale book, its cover frayed and pages yellowed. She had carried it for years, a hand-me-down from her father, and tonight it was all she had to offer. "Hi, Samuel," she whispered, her voice soft as though speaking too loudly might shatter him. "I'm Destiny. I brought you a story." She began to read, her voice low and steady, carrying the rhythm of once familiar bedtime tales. Words about kingdoms and brave children floated gently into the air. Samuel didn't move, didn't glance her way. His small hands only clutched the bunny tighter, as if the words threatened the fragile shell he had built. Still, Destiny didn't stop. She read one page, then another, her voice weaving through the silence like a thread trying to stitch torn fabric. At one point, she paused to glance at him. His eyes hadn't shifted, but she noticed the faintest twitch in his grip, the smallest ripple in his stillness. A crack. From the doorway, Mrs. Lorraine watched quietly. Behind her, further down the hall, stood Matthew Blake. His tall frame leaned against the wall, his face unreadable. His son sat silent. The maid from Brooklyn kept reading, and for the first time in a very long time, the house seemed to wait. Destiny didn't know it yet, but in that frozen room, a battle had already begun. Her patience against his silence, her warmth against the ice that bound him. And though Samuel gave no sign that he heard her, she felt it in her bones. Some part of him was listening. The silence wasn't emptiness, it was a door, waiting for the right hand to turn the handle. The sound of the heavy oak door shutting behind Mrs. Lorraine echoed down the corridor, leaving Destiny alone in the vast silence of the penthouse. She rose from Samuel's room, her knees stiff from crouching, and gently closed the book she had been reading. The boy hadn't turned toward her once, hadn't made a sound, but something in his stillness lingered in her chest like an unfinished sentence. She had felt it, that faint tremor of possibility. When she stepped back into the wide hallway, the air seemed colder. At first she thought she was alone, but then she saw him. Matthew Blake. He stood at the far end of the hall, tall and composed, his suit as immaculate as the gleaming floors. His hands were tucked into his pockets, his shoulders squared, his gaze sharp enough to slice through her. For a moment, Destiny froze, her breath catching in her throat. She had seen men with authority before, landlords, bosses, managers, but Matthew carried something heavier. It wasn't just wealth or power. It was control, threaded into every line of his body. "Your destiny," he said flatly, his voice calm but edged like glass. She nodded. "Yes, sir. I saw." His eyes flicked toward Samuel's door, then back to her. "Reading stories." Destiny hesitated, her tote clutched tighter in her hands. "He seemed alone. I thought it might help." Matthew stepped forward slowly, each footfall measured, until he stood just a few feet away. His presence was overwhelming, the way the cold of winter can seep into bones without permission. "I don't pay people to try things," he said evenly. "I pay them to follow instructions. My son has doctors, he has a schedule. You will not complicate it with your ideas." The words hit her harder than she expected. Complicate ideas. He made her sound like a disruption, an intruder rather than a caregiver. She wanted to swallow her feelings, to nod and stay quiet. But something in his tone pressed against the fire in her chest, the same flame that had carried her through every night shift, every unpaid bill. "With respect, Mr. Blake," she said softly, though her voice did not waver. "Sometimes children don't need more rules. Sometimes they just need someone to sit with them, to remind them they aren't alone." For the briefest moment, Matthew's jaw tightened, his eyes flickering with something, pain maybe, or anger, but the mask returned quickly. He leaned closer, his voice low. "You know nothing about my son." Destiny met his gaze, steady despite the tremor in her hands. "You're right, I don't. But I know what it feels like to lose someone, to feel like no one is listening, and I don't think silence is what Samuel needs most." The space between them grew taut, like a string pulled to its breaking point. Matthew's lips pressed into a hard line. He exhaled sharply through his nose, then straightened, retreating back into his armor. "Do your job, Miss Williams. Clean, cook, maintain order. Leave the rest to the professionals." His words fell like cold stones, final and heavy. He turned abruptly and walked away, his footsteps fading into the distance until the only sound left was the hum of the air vents. Destiny stood in the hallway, her pulse racing. She had only been here a few hours, and already she had felt the walls Matthew had built, not just around his son, but around himself. She let out a slow breath, steadying herself. His warning still rang in her ears, but so did Samuel's silence. So did the flicker of movement she thought she had seen in his small hands. Destiny knew one thing as she returned to her small maid's quarters at the end of the hall. She had walked into a battlefield. Not one fought with weapons, but with patience, compassion, and the courage to stand her ground against a man who had mistaken control for love. And though she felt small in that cold palace, she whispered to herself in the dark, "I will not give up. Not on Samuel. Not on me." What Destiny didn't know was that Matthew Blake, sitting in his study with a glass of untouched whiskey, was repeating his own vow, "No one will break through. Not her, not anyone." The war for Samuel's soul had begun. The following morning, Destiny rose before the sun. The penthouse was silent, its wide rooms draped in shadows. She moved quietly through the kitchen, her footsteps careful on the marble floor, and began preparing breakfast as she had been instructed. Oatmeal, toast, fruit cut into precise slices. The kitchen itself felt more like a showroom than a place where meals were shared. Not a single item was out of place, not even a smudge on the steel counters. It was immaculate but soulless like the rest of the house. When the food was set, she carried a small tray toward Samuel's room. Her palms were damp against the polished wood, but her resolve was firm. She remembered the way he had clutched his rabbit the night before, the way his silence seemed less like stubbornness and more like chains. She couldn't erase that image. Inside, Samuel sat in the same spot as yesterday, his thin legs tucked beneath him, his face turned toward the window as though the world outside might offer him something better than what lived in here. The stuffed bunny was in his arms again, worn ears dangling, threadbare but clearly cherished. "Good morning, Samuel," Destiny whispered. She set the tray on the small table near his bed. "I brought breakfast." He didn't turn. His small shoulders were rigid, his eyes fixed on the trees swaying beyond the glass. Destiny felt a pang deep in her chest, but she pushed past it. She remembered her own nights as a child, waiting for her father to come home, clutching her pillow tight, pretending not to cry. Silence wasn't rejection, it was protection. She pulled out the same old fairy tale book from her tote, the edges bent from years of use. Instead of sitting too close, she took a spot on the floor across the room. She opened the book and began to read. Her voice was steady, soft but full, wrapping the words in warmth. She read of enchanted forests, of children who braved the unknown, of small acts of kindness that saved entire kingdoms. She didn't glance up often, afraid that watching him too closely might drive him deeper into his shell. Instead, she let the rhythm of the story drift naturally, filling the room with something other than silence. After a while, she risked a look. Samuel hadn't moved, but she noticed something small. His hand was no longer gripping the bunny so tightly. The tension in his knuckles had eased, if only slightly. It was enough to make her breath catch. She closed the book gently and placed it beside her. "That's enough for today," she murmured, "but I'll bring another story tomorrow." Still, no answer. But something inside her told her that her words had not fallen into emptiness. They had landed somewhere, even if she couldn't see it yet. From the doorway, Destiny caught sight of a shadow. Matthew stood just beyond the frame, arms folded, his face carved into stone. He hadn't made a sound, but she knew he had been listening. Their eyes met briefly, and for a moment she thought she saw a flicker of doubt in his gaze, as if some part of him wondered if her presence had stirred something in Samuel. But the flicker was gone as quickly as it came. He turned away without a word. Destiny gathered her things, heart pounding, but she didn't feel defeated. Instead, she carried with her the image of Samuel's loosened grip on the bunny, a small, fragile sign that perhaps, just perhaps, the wall surrounding him was not impenetrable after all. As she left the room, she whispered softly to herself, "Even the smallest cracks let light in." What she didn't know was that Matthew, retreating into his study, had heard the same whisper through the half-open door, and it unsettled him more than he cared to admit. The sky outside the tall windows was pale with the weak light of late afternoon when Destiny decided to try something different. She had been polishing the already spotless dining table when she heard Samuel's faint cough from his room. Setting the cloth aside, she gathered her courage and slipped the old book back into her tote, along with something she had picked up days before at a flea market. A small, ridiculous-looking green puppet shaped like a dinosaur. It had cost her $2 and she hadn't known why she bought it then. Now she understood. When she entered Samuel's room, the boy was in his usual place by the window, his small frame curled into the rug, Bunny clutched close. He didn't look up, but Destiny wasn't discouraged. She set her tote down quietly, sat on the floor a safe distance away, and pulled the puppet over her hand. "Hey there," she said softly, lowering her voice into a silly growl. She made the puppet's head bob. "I'm Dino, and I'm very, very hungry." She let out a comically exaggerated roar, then had the puppet stumble across the rug, nearly toppling over. For a moment, the silence was unbearable. Destiny felt the heat of Matthew's warning echo in her mind. Don't complicate things. Maybe she was being foolish. Maybe Samuel would retreat further. Maybe she'd ruin whatever small thread of trust she was weaving. Still, she pressed on. "Oh no!" she cried suddenly, making the puppet slip and fall flat on its face. She flailed its arms dramatically, groaning, "Help! I slipped on a banana peel! Somebody call the bunny doctor!" And then it happened. The sound was so small at first she almost thought she had imagined it. A tiny puff of air, like the faintest giggle escaping lips unused to laughter. Destiny froze, her breath caught, and looked up. Samuel's hand had loosened around the bunny, and his shoulders trembled slightly. He was covering his mouth as if trying to keep the sound from escaping, but it was too late. His body betrayed him. The boy was laughing. It was broken, quiet, uncertain, yet it was laughter, pure and fragile, like the first bird that dares to sing at dawn. Tears pricked Destiny's eyes, but she held them back, afraid to make the moment too heavy. She made the puppet struggle upright again, wobbling dramatically until it collapsed once more in Samuel's lap. "Save me, bunny doctor," she cried in mock despair. This time the giggle came louder. A genuine, breathy chuckle burst free from Samuel's lips, his small chest shaking with the effort. He hid his face in his bunny's ear, but the sound was there, undeniable, echoing in the room like music that had been locked away for too long. Destiny's heart swelled so sharply she thought it might burst. She wanted to reach for him, to hold him, but she stayed where she was, giving him space. All she offered was a soft smile, her voice warm. "That's a strong laugh, Samuel. Thank you for sharing it with me." What she didn't realize was that she wasn't the only one listening. In the hallway, hidden in the shadow of the doorframe, Matthew stood stiff as stone. He had come to check on her, prepared to scold if necessary, but now he found himself paralyzed. His son's laughter, something he hadn't heard since Anna's death, rang in his ears. It filled him with something he couldn't name: relief, joy, fear. The emotions tangled until they felt unbearable. He turned sharply, retreating before Destiny or Samuel could notice, his footsteps silent against the polished floor. Inside, Samuel's small chuckle faded into a sigh as he leaned his head against the window. The bunny rested against his chest, but his grip was no longer so desperate. Destiny watched him quietly, her own heart beating in time with his fragile courage. She whispered, not for him to hear but for herself, "We'll find our way back, Samuel. I promise." That night, as the penthouse settled into its usual quiet, a new sound lingered faintly in its walls, the echo of a child's laugh, a sound that would haunt Matthew, soften Destiny, and shift the course of everything that lay ahead. That night, the penthouse glowed with its usual sterile perfection, but beneath the chandeliers and polished marble, the air was different. A laugh, a single fragile sound, still seemed to hum in the walls. For Destiny, it had been a victory, small but precious, a proof that Samuel's silence wasn't absolute. For Matthew, it was something else entirely. Destiny had just finished rinsing dishes in the vast kitchen when she heard his footsteps. They were steady, purposeful, one striking the floor like a warning. She dried her hands on a towel and turned just as Matthew Blake appeared in the doorway. His face was calm, but his eyes, cold and sharp, made the air feel heavy. "I need to speak with you," he said. His voice carried no warmth, no room for refusal. Destiny's heart picked up speed, but she nodded. "Yes, sir." He didn't move closer. Instead, he stood tall and unyielding, his arms folded across his chest, the perfect portrait of control. "Earlier," he said slowly, "I heard something unusual. My son laughing." Destiny's breath caught. For a flicker of a moment, she thought he might smile, that he might recognize the miracle for what it was. But instead, his jaw tightened, and his words cut through the room like ice. "You will not do that again." Her brow furrowed. "Excuse me?" He stepped closer now, his presence overwhelming. "My son's condition is delicate. Every doctor, every specialist has told me the same thing. He needs structure, not games. He doesn't need false hope from puppets and silly tricks." Destiny stood frozen, the towel still clutched in her hands. She could feel anger stirring in her chest, pressing against the fear that told her to keep quiet. "With respect, Mr. Blake," she said softly but firmly, "that wasn't false hope. That was your son, laughing. For the first time in years, maybe. Isn't that worth something?" Matthew's eyes narrowed, his voice low and cutting. "What I need is order, not sentimentality from a girl who doesn't understand this house, this family, or what's at stake. Do what you're paid to do, nothing more." Destiny felt her cheeks burn, but she refused to drop her gaze. She thought of Samuel clutching that rabbit like a lifeline, of his tiny shoulders shaking with laughter. That sound had been real. It had mattered. She couldn't let Matthew erase it with his walls of pride. "I may not know everything about your world," she said quietly, her voice trembling only at the edges, "but I know pain when I see it. That boy is drowning in it, and you can't smother it with rules. You can't scare it away with silence." Matthew flinched so subtly it was almost invisible, but Destiny caught it, the crack in his armor. Still he masked it with steel, his tone cold as winter. "Enough. Stay in your place, Miss Williams, or I'll find someone who can." The words struck like a blow, final and sharp. Destiny's chest tightened, and for a moment she wondered if she had pushed too far. But as Matthew turned and walked away, leaving the kitchen cloaked in silence once more, she felt something stronger than fear settle inside her. She would not abandon Samuel, not for Matthew's commands, not for the threat of losing this job, because for the first time since stepping foot in this house, she had heard something pure. A child's laugh, rising like sunlight through the cracks. Destiny whispered to herself, her voice firm despite the tears burning in her eyes. "He can fire me if he wants, but I won't stop fighting for that boy." And upstairs, behind the heavy door of his study, Matthew Blake sat with a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand, Samuel's laugh echoing mercilessly in his mind. It haunted him because deep down, he feared Destiny was right. The morning sun poured through the penthouse windows, spilling gold across the marble floors, but inside the air felt colder than the season outside. Destiny moved quietly through the halls, dusting, straightening, polishing, her hands busy, her mind restless. The clash with Matthew the night before still echoed in her chest. His words had been sharp, but sharper still was the truth she carried with her. Samuel had laughed. That sound could not be erased, no matter how many rules Matthew tried to bury it beneath. He carried a small tray into Samuel's room. He was seated in his usual spot by the window, his bunny clutched against his chest like a shield. The light fell on his pale face, making his eyes seem even more distant. Destiny set the tray on the small table and lowered herself onto the rug, leaving space between them. "Good morning, Samuel," she said softly. "I brought oatmeal, blueberries too." He didn't move, not even a flicker in her direction. Destiny tried again, pulling a picture book from her tote. She flipped through the pages, telling the story in a low, rhythmic voice. At first, nothing changed. Then, as she leaned forward slightly to set the book closer to him, she saw it. The way his small body stiffened, his arms tightening around the bunny, his eyes darting quickly as if bracing for something terrible. Destiny froze. She hadn't touched him, hadn't even brushed against him, but his reaction was instant, raw. Fear. Not of the story, not of her voice, but of closeness itself. She withdrew her hand slowly, her heart sinking. Her mind raced back to nights from her own childhood when loneliness wrapped around her like a blanket too heavy to breathe beneath. She knew that fear. She knew what it meant to shrink away, even when what you wanted most was someone to hold you. "It's all right, Samuel," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I won't come closer. You're safe." But the boy stayed rigid, his bunny crushed against him, eyes shining with something unspeakable. The sound of footsteps broke the fragile moment. Matthew's voice filled the doorway, deep and curt. "Is he eating?" Destiny rose quickly. "Not yet, Not yet," Matthew repeated, his gaze flicking to his son. His face hardened, though beneath it lingered something else, a shadow of helplessness. "Keep to the routine, Miss Williams, nothing more." He turned and left without waiting for her answer. Destiny swallowed her frustration, biting back words that would have only ended with another warning. She turned back to Samuel, but the boy was once again still as stone. Later that week, the breaking point came. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon, the air outside heavy with the smell of rain. Samuel sat at the table, his bunny propped beside his bowl of orange juice. Destiny was nearby, folding napkins, when she noticed his small hand tremble as he tried to lift the glass. "Careful, sweetheart," she said softly. But the glass slipped. Juice spilled across the linen, dripping down onto the rug. The boy froze, his breath catching. In the same instant, Matthew stormed into the room. His eyes landed on the spreading stain, and his voice cracked like thunder. "Samuel," he barked, "how many times have I told you to be careful? This room isn't for making messes." The boy flinched violently, his tiny hands flying up to shield his head. He curled into himself, trembling, lips quivering but no sound escaping. His small body shook as though bracing for a blow that never came. "Stop!" Destiny cried, rushing forward. She crouched between them, her arms instinctively shielding Samuel. "He's just a child. It was an accident." Matthew's face darkened, his voice low and sharp. "Step back. We don't need heroes here." Destiny's eyes burned, but she held her ground for a moment longer, feeling Samuel's trembling seep into her own skin. His fear was so raw it left her breathless. Slowly she lowered her arms, but her voice remained steady. "You think you're protecting him with all your rules and anger. But look at him. You're only teaching him to be afraid." For the first time, Matthew faltered. His jaw clenched, but his gaze dropped to his son, small, shaking, his face buried in his bunny's ear. Something flickered in Matthew's eyes, something he didn't want anyone to see. He turned abruptly, his steps echoing as he left the room, the sound of the door slamming shut reverberating through the penthouse. Destiny stayed by Samuel's side, her hand resting carefully on the table, not touching him, but close enough that he could feel she hadn't left. Her own tears blurred her vision as she whispered, "You don't have to be afraid. Not with me here. Not ever." That night, alone in her small quarters, Destiny pressed her forehead to the glass of her tiny window, her pillow damp with tears. For the first time since stepping into this house, doubt crept in. Could she really reach Samuel when his father's walls were so high, so impenetrable? But then she remembered the laugh, that small precious sound that had cut through all the silence, and she whispered to herself, "If he can laugh once, he can laugh again. I'll fight for that laugh, no matter what it takes." In his study, Matthew sat alone, a glass of whiskey untouched at his side. He rubbed his temples, Samuel's trembling replaying in his mind. For the first time in years, he questioned not his son, but himself. The storm outside had been building all evening, its low growl rumbling over the city, but inside the penthouse the storm was already raging. Matthew had locked himself away in his study, the door shut firmly, as if it were a barrier against the memory of his son cowering on the floor. He sat in the leather chair behind his desk, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on the amber liquid in the glass before him. He hadn't touched it. The silence was heavy, pressing in on him, broken only by the faint hum of the rain against the windows. A soft knock at the door interrupted the stillness. "Come in," he muttered, his voice low, resigned. The door opened slowly, and Mrs. Lorraine Blake stepped inside. Her silver hair caught the glow of the desk lamp, her sharp eyes softened but steady. She didn't pause at the threshold the way others might. She crossed the room with quiet authority and lowered herself into the chair opposite her son. For a moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the faint crackle of the storm outside. Then Lorraine folded her hands in her lap and said firmly, "You cannot keep going on like this, Matthew." He looked up sharply, his jaw tightening. "I don't know what you mean." "You know exactly what I mean." Her voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "I saw Samuel today. I saw the way he shrank from you. That wasn't discipline. That was fear." Matthew's face hardened. He leaned back, his shoulders taut. "He has to learn. He has to—" "No." Lorraine cut him off, her tone sharper now. "What he needs is not another rule, not another lecture barked at him from across the room. What he needs is to feel safe. What he needs is love." The word hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. Matthew flinched as though it had cut him. He turned his face away, staring at the shelves lined with books he hadn't opened in months. You think I don't love my son? You think I don't stay awake every night, terrified that I'm losing him too? I lost Anna, I can't. His voice broke before he caught it, pressing his lips into a thin, angry line. Lorraine's eyes softened, but she didn't back down. I don't doubt that you love him, but love isn't fear, Matthew. Love isn't control. Love is presence. And right now what Samuel sees in you is not love. It is a man drowning in his own grief, dragging his son down with him. Her words pierced deeper than she knew. Matthew clenched his fists against the armrests, his body taut with the effort of holding himself together. He remembered the way Samuel's little body had curled in on itself, trembling, hands over his head. That image gnawed at him, though he tried to shove it away. Lorraine leaned forward, her voice lower now, threaded with sorrow. Do you remember when you were Samuel's age? Your father was so consumed by his business deals that he barely looked your way. You grew up thinking love was measured in rules and rewards, and it nearly broke you. Don't do the same to your son. Matthew's throat tightened, his composure cracking just enough for the pain to bleed through. If I let go, if I lose control, I'll lose him. Just like I lost her. Her gaze didn't waver. No, Matthew. If you don't let go, if you don't open your heart again, you'll lose him anyway. This house will suffocate the both of you. The storm outside broke then, rain hammering against the glass, thunder rolling close and loud. The timing felt almost deliberate, as if the city itself demanded he listen. Matthew dropped his gaze to the floor, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. His mask of coldness wavered, though only for a moment. He didn't answer, but he didn't send her away either. That, Lorraine thought, was enough for now. She rose slowly, resting a hand on his shoulder before leaving. Samuel Dosas, he doesn't need a warden. He needs his father. And Destiny, she may be the only one in this house who still sees him as more than a problem to be solved. Don't drive her away before she can help him. When the door shut softly behind her, Matthew sat in the dim light, his heart pounding, the words he had spent years burying clawing their way back to the surface. In the quiet, he whispered to no one, "How do I let go without breaking apart?" But there was no answer, only the echo of the storm and the memory of his son's laugh, fragile and haunting, the one sound he could neither silence nor forget. The storm had gathered its full force by nightfall, sweeping across the city with rain that battered the windows like a relentless drum. Lightning split the sky, throwing jagged flashes across the penthouse walls, followed by thunder that rattled the crystal chandeliers. Inside, the silence was thick, oppressive, each person in the house retreating to their corners as if bracing for impact. Destiny sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the maid's quarters, staring out at the dark city. She had cried herself empty the night before, but tonight she felt nothing but a gnawing ache. Samuel's trembling face wouldn't leave her mind, nor Matthew's furious eyes. She pressed her hand to her chest, whispering, "If I give up now, he'll stay trapped forever. I can't let him stay in the dark." The lights flickered once, twice, then went out. The entire penthouse plunged into sudden blackness. Gasps echoed down the hall, Samuel's thin, terrified cry rising above them. Destiny shot to her feet, her heart pounding. "Samuel!" She fumbled for the door, racing through the dark corridors, guided only by the boy's sobs. When she reached his room, she found him curled in the corner, clutching his bunny so tight it looked like it might tear in two. His shoulders shook violently, each sob louder than the storm outside. "Shh, baby, it's all right," Destiny murmured, kneeling beside him. She didn't touch him, she knew better, but she set her voice steady, warm, soothing, like the lullabies her Moe used to sing. "I'm here. The lights are just playing tricks, but they'll come back. You're safe." Samuel's sobs slowed but didn't stop. He peeked at her through wet lashes, his lips trembling. The raw terror in his eyes cut Destiny to the bone. She grabbed the small flashlight she always kept in her tote, clicking it on. A soft circle of light bloomed between them, chasing away the shadows. "There we go," she whispered, letting the beam dance over the walls, making silly shapes, a bird, a rabbit, a crooked star. Samuel's sobs softened into hiccups. "Destiny?" Mrs. Lorraine's voice came from the hall, candlelight spilling in as she entered. She handed one candle to Destiny, then set another near the window. The golden glow filled the room, soft and steady, turning the storm outside into a distant echo. Moments later, heavy footsteps announced Matthew's arrival. He carried another flashlight, his face sharp with tension, his eyes immediately finding his son. He froze at the sight, Samuel trembling but no longer screaming, his gaze fixed on the silly light shapes Destiny drew on the wall. Matthew's chest rose and fell heavily. For once he didn't bark an order. He simply stood there watching, his hand tightening around the flashlight until his knuckles whitened. "Sit with us," Destiny said softly, surprising herself. She didn't look at him, just kept her focus on Samuel, her voice calm and inviting. He needs to know he isn't alone in the dark. For a long moment, Matthew didn't move. His pride battled his fear, his instinct to control clashing with the sight of his son's fragile trust resting in someone else's hands. Finally, with a sigh that sounded almost like surrender, he crossed the room and sat on the rug a short distance away. Samuel's eyes flicked to him, then back to Destiny, but he didn't shrink away. He let out a tiny whimper, then nestled deeper into the corner. Destiny shifted the flashlight, turning the glow into a clumsy dinosaur. "See, Samuel? Even in the dark, the dinosaur can still find his way. He's a little silly, but he's brave." Samuel let out a soft, broken giggle, barely a sound, but enough to silence the storm inside the room. Matthew's eyes widened, his lips parted, but no words came. That sound, so small, yet so full of life, struck him harder than any storm ever could. He swallowed hard, lowering his gaze, his jaw trembling ever so slightly. The three of them sat in that fragile cocoon of candlelight, the storm raging outside but powerless against the warmth blooming within. Destiny kept the stories going, weaving silly adventures, until Samuel's head drooped and his tiny body sagged with sleep. The bunny clutched loosely against his chest. Silence settled once again, but it was no longer oppressive. It was fragile, intimate. Destiny carefully set the flashlight aside, covering the boy with a blanket. Then she rose to leave, but when she reached the door, she felt his presence behind her. "Destiny," Matthew said, his voice low, hoarse. She turned, the flickering candlelight catching the strain on his face. His gray eyes, always so cold, were softer now, haunted, almost pleading. He stood there, shoulders tense as though carrying a weight too heavy to bear. He faltered, words caught in his throat. For a man who built his world on control, admitting weakness was like cutting open his own chest. "I don't know how to do this. I thought, rules, order, control. That's how I'd keep him safe. But tonight I saw..." His voice cracked, his eyes glistening with the reflection of the flame. "I saw how much I've been wrong." Destiny's heart ached at the sight of him, stripping of his armor, broken beneath the weight of love and fear. She stepped closer, her voice steady but full of emotion. "He doesn't need perfection, Matthew. He doesn't need control. He needs you, just you. Flawed, hurting, scared, but there. He needs to know you'll choose him, even when you're afraid." The storm outside softened to a gentle rain, as though the world itself had stilled to listen. For the first time since she'd entered this house, Destiny saw Matthew not as the cold millionaire who barked commands, but as a father, fragile and human, desperate not to lose what little he had left. In the flickering candlelight, his gray eyes locked with hers, and in that silence, something shifted. A fragile bridge, built not of rules or pride, but of shared pain, honesty, and the faintest spark of hope. The morning after the storm, the penthouse felt different. The air wasn't as heavy, and the silence didn't press so cruelly against the walls. It was as if the storm had washed something away, leaving behind a fragile clarity. Destiny woke early as always, but when she stepped out into the kitchen to begin breakfast, she froze. Matthew was already there. He stood at the counter awkwardly, sleeves rolled up, trying and failing to cut vegetables with a chef's knife. The carrots lay in uneven chunks, some sliced thick, others nearly paper thin. For the first time, Destiny saw him not as the cold, untouchable master of the house, but as a man fumbling with something as simple as breakfast. When he glanced up and saw her, he almost looked embarrassed. "I thought I'd try something different," he said stiffly. His voice lacked its usual authority. It sounded uncertain. Destiny held back a smile and stepped forward. "Samuel won't mind the shape of the carrots. He'll just be happy you made them." He looked at her then, really looked, as though weighing her words. Slowly, he set the knife down. "He laughed last night," Matthew said quietly. "First time in over a year." His voice faltered, as though the weight of that truth nearly crushed him. Destiny nodded gently. That laugh was his way of reaching out. "He's ready, Matthew, but he needs more than rules or doctors. He needs moments like that, simple ones, messy ones, the kind that let him feel alive again." Her words lingered in the room. For a long moment Matthew didn't reply, but the silence wasn't hostile. It was contemplative, as though the wall between them had cracked just enough for him to let her words through. Later that afternoon, when Samuel shuffled into the living room clutching his worn bunny, Matthew was waiting for him on the floor with a box of Lego blocks. The boy hesitated, his gray eyes darting toward Destiny as if asking if it was safe. She knelt beside him and whispered, "It's okay, sweetheart. Go see what Daddy built." Samuel edged closer, his tiny hands clutching his toy for courage. Matthew's large hands fumbled as he connected a crooked tower of bricks. "It's not much," he said with a quiet laugh that startled even himself, "but maybe you can help me fix it." At first Samuel only stared, then slowly he reached out and added a red block to the tower. It wobbled dangerously, and Destiny's heart caught in her chest, but then Matthew steadied it with one hand. He didn't correct Samuel, he didn't scold, he simply whispered, "Perfect." The word was like a spark. Samuel's eyes lifted, meeting his father's, and for the first time in months there was no fear, only cautious wonder. From that moment, something began to shift. The days still carried shadows of Matthew's old habits, moments when his voice grew sharp, when his instinct to control reared its head, but each time Destiny's steady presence anchored him. She spoke gently when he faltered, and to his own surprise, he began to listen. Together, they created small rituals, story time in the evenings. Samuel nestled between them as Destiny read, and Matthew, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes with genuine warmth, added his voice to the tale. Morning walks to the balcony where they pointed out sparrows hopping along the railing, tiny steps, but steps nonetheless. And Samuel began to change. His silences were no longer endless voids. Some mornings he whispered words, juice, car, bunny. One afternoon, as Destiny sang a soft lullaby, he reached out a tentative hand and placed it on hers. Her breath caught, tears burning her eyes, but she didn't move, didn't scare him away. She simply held still, letting him choose how much to give. Matthew saw it too. Saw the way Samuel leaned into Destiny's warmth, the way she pulled laughter and light from places he thought were long buried. And with every moment, his own walls began to crumble. One evening, as the sun sank low and bathed the penthouse in amber light, Destiny sat with Samuel on the rug, building a crooked Lego house. Matthew stood by the doorway watching quietly, his hands deep in his pockets. For the first time, instead of resentment or suspicion, he felt something else, something gentler, though he could hardly name it. Hope. But with that hope came fear. If Samuel could laugh again, if he could speak again, then maybe, just maybe, he could walk again. And that possibility terrified Matthew as much as it thrilled him. Because to hope was to risk losing everything once more. Yet as he watched Destiny's soft patience, her steady courage, he knew one thing with aching clarity: she was no ordinary housekeeper. She was the flame that refused to die in the dark. And maybe, just maybe, she was the only chance Samuel, and he himself, had left. The city was waking beneath a gray, overcast morning, but inside the penthouse, something unexpected had shifted. Samuel sat at the breakfast table, his bunny tucked beneath one arm, while Destiny sliced his fruit into neat little shapes, stars, hearts, even a lopsided moon. He was watching. For weeks he'd avoided eye contact, but today his eyes followed the gentle movement of her hands, wide and cautious, as though he were seeing her for the very first time. Destin. I slid the small plate toward him. Here you go, sweetheart. Special shapes just for you. Samuel hesitated, then reached for a star-shaped apple slice. His lips parted slightly, and a sound escaped, barely audible, but enough to make Destiny's heart slam against her ribs. He didn't finish the word, but it was there, trembling, alive. Destiny's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. She simply smiled, her voice warm. Yes, Star, you did it. From the other end of the table, Matthew's fork froze in his hand, his head lifted sharply, his gaze locking onto his son as though he might have imagined it. His gray eyes flicked to Destiny, searching her face for confirmation, then back to Samuel. His lips parted, but no sound came. Samuel took another bite, chewing slowly, his bunny pressed to his chest. And then, soft as a whisper, another word slipped out. Bunny. The room went silent. Even Mrs. Lorraine, who had been pouring coffee, turned with wide eyes. Destiny clasped her hands together to keep from rushing forward. Every instinct in her screamed to scoop him up and shower him with praise, but she knew Samuel needed space, not pressure. She steadied her voice. Yes, Bunny, you're so smart, Samuel. Matthew leaned back in his chair, staring at his son as though the ground beneath him had given way. For so long he had lived with silence, believing his boy was locked in a world he could never reach. Now, with two fragile words, everything he thought was unshakable began to crumble. Later that day, Destiny carried Samuel's plate to the sink while Matthew lingered in the kitchen. His voice was low, rough, almost like gravel. He spoke. Destiny dried her hands slowly, turning to face him. Because he feels safe. Because someone finally listens without pushing him too hard. Matthew's jaw tightened, as though every word pierced his pride. But beneath the tension in his face, Destiny caught it, a flicker of something softer. Vulnerability. That evening, when the house quieted and the city lights glowed through the tall windows, Destiny sat on the rug with Samuel, building a crooked Lego tower. Samuel stacked one block, then another, lips moving silently as if testing the feel of words. Destiny kept her voice calm, telling a simple story about the tower that wanted to touch the sky. From the staircase, Matthew watched again. He stood half in shadow, but his eyes weren't cold. They carried the weight of a man torn between awe and fear. Awe at the miracle unfolding before him, fear of what it meant, because hope, once lost, was the most dangerous thing to touch again. Samuel reached too far, the tower toppled, and for the first time in months he laughed. Really laughed, head tilted back, cheeks flushed, a bright, unrestrained sound that filled every corner of the penthouse. Destiny laughed with him, her heart aching with joy. She glanced up and saw Matthew frozen in place, his hands gripping the railing. His shoulders shook, just barely, but she saw the sheen in his eyes before he turned away. That night, long after Samuel had fallen asleep, Destiny sat by the window in her tiny room, staring at the city lights. She thought of the boy's laugh, of the way Matthew had looked at him, and felt her chest swell with something she couldn't name. For the first time, she believed not only in Samuel's healing, but in the possibility of healing for Matthew too. But she also knew this was just the beginning. The walls around Matthew's heart were thick, built brick by brick from grief and guilt. Samuel's laughed. Her had cracked them, but only slightly. The real test was yet to come. For when hope begins to flicker in a house long buried in silence, it doesn't just heal, it threatens to tear open every old wound. And Matthew Blake was a man whose wounds ran deeper than most. The autumn sun slipped through the tall windows of the penthouse, staining the marble floors with streaks of gold. Samuel sat near the balcony doors, his bunny clutched against his chest, eyes locked on the light as if it were something foreign, something unreachable. Destiny knelt beside him, a box of colorful building blocks spread across the rug. She had learned to approach him like the dawn, softly, slowly, never all at once. Today she stacked the blocks into a crooked train, humming a tune her mother used to sing. Samuel watched in silence, his little chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Then, as if gathering unseen courage, he leaned forward and added one block to her train. Destiny's heart thudded. She kept her voice calm. "That's perfect, sweetheart. You're helping it grow." From the kitchen doorway, Matthew watched, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His gaze flicked from Samuel's trembling hands to Destiny's steady smile, and for the briefest moment, something shifted behind his eyes, hope, raw and terrifying. But Samuel wasn't done. After a long pause, he pushed his hands against the rug and lifted himself slightly, wobbling as he shifted his weight. His bunny tumbled to the floor. Destiny's breath caught in her throat. She didn't move, didn't dare interrupt. She only whispered, "You can do it, Samuel. I'm right here." The boy's knees trembled as he pressed harder, trying to rise. For a fleeting second, he balanced on his feet, unsteady, fragile, like a sapling fighting against the wind. Then he toppled backward onto the rug. Destiny gasped and reached out instinctively, but Samuel wasn't crying. He looked down at his own legs, his small hands twitching as if realizing for the first time that they belonged to him. A sound broke the silence, a sharp inhale. Destiny turned. Matthew stood frozen, his knuckles white against the doorframe. His eyes glistened and his lips trembled as though he were holding back words too heavy to release. He had waited so long for this moment, dreamed of it, prayed for it in silence, but now that it was here, his fear pressed harder than his hope. Destiny's voice was soft, meant for both father and son. "He's ready, Matthew. He just needs patience. He needs us to believe." Matthew's jaw clenched. He stepped forward, his shadow stretching across the rug. "No," he said, his voice rough. "It's too soon. He'll get hurt." Samuel shrank back at the sharpness in his tone. Destiny reached for the boy, steadying him with her hand. Her own eyes rose to meet Matthew's, unflinching. "He didn't fall, Matthew. He tried. That's what matters. Don't take this from him." For a moment, the room felt like it might shatter. Matthew's control battled with his terror, the same fear that had ruled him since the night he lost his wife. He wanted to lock Samuel away from risk, away from pain, but in doing so, he had caged the boy's very life. Samuel reached for his bunny again, clutching it tightly, but then his small voice whispered something faint. "Try. Again." The words hit Matthew like a storm. He staggered, almost as if the floor had shifted beneath him. His son, silent for so long, was asking for another chance, not just to speak, but to stand. Destiny's hand trembled as she brushed Samuel's hair gently. Her voice wavered with tears she wouldn't let fall. "Yes, sweetheart, we'll try again, as many times as it takes." Matthew turned away, his chest heaving as he fought to hide the tears burning in his eyes. He pressed his palm against the cold glass of the window, staring out at the city that seemed to mock his weakness. But behind him, the sound of Samuel's laugh, bitter, small, fleeting, yet brighter than any music, echoed into the hollow places of his heart. That night, Matthew sat alone in his study, the storm inside him unrelenting. He had witnessed a miracle, and yet it terrified him. Because miracles meant hope, and hope meant risk. To hope was to open himself again to the pain of losing everything. Destiny, in her small room down the hall, lay awake staring at the ceiling. She could still feel Samuel's trembling hand in hers, still hear his whisper, "Try again." That tiny voice carried more strength than an army, and in that moment, she vowed she would never let Matthew's fear extinguish it. Samuel had taken his first step, not with his feet, but with his will. The rest of the journey had only just begun. The rain fell hard against the glass that evening, streaking the penthouse windows in restless rivers. The city beyond blurred into shadows and lights, a world that seemed too alive, too careless, while inside the grand apartment, silence pressed down like a weight. Matthew sat alone in his study, the amber glow of a single desk lamp casting long, hollow shadows across the room. Papers lay untouched before him. His glass of scotch sat half full, the ice long since melted. He stared at nothing, at memories that weren't in the room but inside his chest, haunting him. He could still hear Samuel's small voice echoing from earlier that day. "Try again." 2 words. Two fragile syllables that cracked open everything Matthew had buried for years. He slammed the glass down harder than he meant to, the sound shattering through the silence. His hands trembled. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath, his voice hoarse. He pressed his palms against his face, but it did nothing to block out the image of Samuel wobbling, almost standing. It should have filled him with pride, but all Matthew felt was fear, a sick, consuming terror. Because, see if Samuel tried again, if he failed, if he got hurt. Matthew knew he would shatter. A quiet knock broke the silence. He stiffened, quickly wiping at his eyes, masking the crack in his armor. "Come in," he said, his tone low and clipped. The door creaked open, and Destiny stepped in. She didn't belong in this room. The heavy oak shelves, the stiff leather chairs, the air still clinging to years of Matthew's solitude. And yet, in her simple sweater and tired eyes, she seemed more real here than anything else. "Samuel's asleep," she said softly. "He asked me to leave the lamp on. He's not afraid of the dark anymore." Matthew's chest tightened, but he gave no reply. He only stared at his desk, knuckles white against the wood. Destiny stepped closer, her voice steady but gentle. "I know why you're afraid. I see it in your eyes every time Samuel takes a step, every time he reaches for something new. You're terrified that if you let him try, you'll lose him." His head snapped up, gray-blue eyes blazing. "You don't know what it's like," he bit out, his voice breaking under the weight of restrained fury. "You don't know what it's like to watch the person you love most bleed out in front of you, to hold them in your arms and realize you can't save them, to bury them and then wake up every morning to their child staring at you with the same eyes, reminding you of your failure." Destiny didn't flinch. Her own eyes shimmered, but she held his gaze without wavering. "You're right," she said quietly. "I don't know that exact pain, but I do know what it's like to lose the only man who believed in me. I know what it's like to hear my mother coughing in the night, wondering if she'll live to see another morning. I know what it's like to give up everything so my brother could have a chance at life. Grief is different for all of us, Matthew, but pain is universal." Matthew's breath came ragged, his chest rising and falling as though he were fighting the tiddes inside him. Destiny stepped closer until she was just a few feet away. Her voice dropped softer now, breaking with the weight of her own truth. "The difference between us is that I let myself feel it. I let it break me, and because of that I could keep moving. You've built a prison out of control thinking it would protect Samuel. But you're not protecting him. You're suffocating him, and you're killing yourself in the process." For a long moment, Matthew said nothing. His hand trembled as he reached for the glass again, but he couldn't bring himself to drink. The fury in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by something raw, something he could no longer contain. His voice cracked as he whispered, almost to himself, "If he falls, if something happens to him, I couldn't survive it." Destiny's throat tightened, but she didn't look away. Instead, she crossed the space between them, her voice steady. "Then don't face it alone." Her hand hovered for a moment, then she placed it gently on his arm. It was the first time she had ever touched him, and for a second Matthew froze, his body rigid. But he didn't pull away. He let it stay, the warmth of her hand searing through years of cold walls. His eyes burned as he looked at her, the mask finally breaking. "I don't know how," he admitted, voice raw, stripped of all pretense. Destiny's lips curved in the faintest trembling smile. "Then let Samuel teach you. Let him fall, let him laugh, let him live. That's how you'll both learn." The words hung heavy in the silence, and for the first time in years Matthew didn't feel like he was drowning alone. He felt seen, exposed, but also, strangely, relieved. That night, long after Destiny had left his study, Matthew sat in the dark, her words echoing in his chest. For the first time since his wife's death, he let himself cry. Silent, broken sobs that no longer felt like weakness, but release. And somewhere in the quiet halls of the penthouse, Samuel stirred in his sleep, whispering one word into the night, "Daddy." The sound carried like a promise. The morning sun spilled across the penthouse, warm and golden, as if the city itself had chosen that day to offer a rare gentleness. Samuel sat cross-legged on the rug, his bunny tucked under one arm, building towers with his colorful blocks. His lips moved as though he were whispering to the stuffed toy, but no sound came out. His eyes, however, carried a new light, something fragile yet undeniable. Destiny sat nearby, folding laundry in a neat pile, her presence calm and steady as always. She hummed softly, the same tune she had sung since her earliest days in the Blake home. Samuel leaned closer to the blocks, arranging them in clumsy little patterns. For a boy who had lived in silence for so long, the mere act of trying seemed miraculous. The sound of footsteps broke the stillness, heavy, deliberate, but slower than usual. When Matthew appeared in the doorway, something about him was different. The sharp edges of his usual presence had softened, as though the storm inside him had finally begun to quiet. He wasn't in one of his cold, immaculate suits. Instead, he wore a simple sweater, his sleeves rolled carelessly, his hair less controlled, less perfect. Samuel noticed him first. His little body stiffened, instinctively wary of his father's watchful gaze. Matthew froze in place, guilt flashing in his eyes at how deeply his son had learned to fear him. Destiny caught it too. She spoke gently, her voice like a bridge stretched between father and son. "Samuel's building a castle today. Do you want to see it?" Matthew hesitated. The words caught in his throat. For years he had been the man of rules and commands, but now, standing in the morning light, he wasn't sure what role to play. Finally, he stepped closer, lowering himself onto the rug. The movement felt foreign, almost awkward, like he was trespassing on unfamiliar ground. Samuel's gray eyes flickered nervously, his bunny clutched tighter. Matthew cleared his throat, his voice rough but quieter than usual. "That's a strong castle." Samuel didn't answer, but his tiny hands kept stacking the blocks higher and higher until the tower began to wobble. Destiny leaned in with a smile. "Looks like it needs one more piece." Matthew reached out slowly, his hand hovering above the pile of blocks. Samuel froze, his chest rising quickly, uncertain whether to retreat or trust. For a breathless second, Matthew considered pulling away, afraid of the rejection he knew might follow. But then, in a rare act of surrender, he picked up a single block and handed it to his son. The silence was deafening. Samuel stared at the block, his small lips parting slightly. Then, hesitant, almost trembling, he took it. His fingers brushed Matthew's hand for the briefest second before he placed the block carefully atop the tower. Destiny's breath caught. A simple touch, but monumental. Matthew's eyes burned as he whispered, almost to himself, "Good job." The words were stiff, rusty, but they were real. For the first time, Samuel turned his face fully toward his father. His lips quivered, and then, in a voice so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind, he spoke. "Daddy." The words sliced through Matthew like lightning, tearing down walls he had lived behind for years. His breath faltered, his chest heaving, and before he could stop it, tears welled in his eyes. He pressed his hand against his mouth, a broken sound slipping through. Destiny's own eyes shone, her voice shaking. "He said it. Matthew, he called you." Matthew didn't move, didn't breathe. His son, silent for so long, had found the courage to speak. And not just any word. "Daddy." Samuel's face crumpled as though unsure if he'd done something wrong. Destiny quickly reached for him, but before she could, Matthew leaned forward, his hands trembling as he touched his son's shoulder. "No, no, Samuel. You did perfect," Matthew whispered, his voice breaking. "You did perfect." Samuel blinked up at him, eyes wide, then reached out with his tiny hands and clutched his father's sweater. He buried his face into Matthew's chest, and in that instant, years of silence shattered. Matthew wrapped his arms around his son, holding him for the first time not with control, but with desperate love. His tears fell freely onto Samuel's hair, each one washing away the years of distance, fear, and guilt that had stood between them. Destiny turned away slightly, her own tears spilling as she watched father and son finally bridge the chasm of grief. In that moment, she understood something powerful. Samuel hadn't just healed himself, he had healed his father. The morning light poured over the three of them, and for the first time in the Blake penthouse, the air felt alive, not with perfection, not with control, but with something far more sacred: hope. The therapy center smelled faintly of pine and lavender, the crisp Seattle air filtering in through wide glass doors that overlooked a stretch of green fields. The place was nothing like the cold, sterile offices Samuel had been dragged to in the past. Here, the walls were painted with bright murals of forests and rivers, and the sound of gentle guitar chords drifted softly from a nearby room. It felt alive, welcoming. Destiny held Samuel's small hand as they entered, his tiny fingers curled trustingly around hers. He no longer clutched his bunny quite as desperately as before, though it still dangled from his other hand, its ears worn thin with love. Matthew walked close behind them, his face pale, as if each step into this new chapter felt like walking across thin ice. He wanted to believe, but fear still clung to him like a shadow. "Good morning," the therapist greeted warmly, kneeling down to Samuel's height. She had kind eyes and a calm voice, the kind of presence that made children lean in rather than seats. "Hi away. Are you ready for something new today?" Samuel glanced at Destiny, then at Matthew. For the first time, he didn't hide. He nodded, his lips pressed tight, but determination flickered in his eyes. The session began gently, with music, with dogs wagging their tails, with small movements disguised as play. Samuel's laugh rang out once when a golden retriever licked his cheek, and Destiny's heart leapt at the sound. Matthew's hand tightened into a fist at his side, fighting tears, afraid that hope might betray him again. Then came the moment. The therapist coaxed Samuel toward a small set of parallel bars. "We'll just try, sweetheart," she said. "No pressure." Destiny crouched beside him, her voice low, encouraging. "Remember the castle you built? How strong it was. You're even stronger." Samuel clutched the bars, his knuckles white, his little legs trembled, knees stiff, but this time, unlike all the times before, he didn't retreat. He looked over his shoulder, straight at Matthew. "Daddy, watch me." The words landed like thunder. Matthew's heart lurched, his breath gone, his vision blurring with tears. He nodded, his voice breaking. "I'm here, son. I'm watching." Samuel took one shaky step. His knees buckled, but he caught himself. Another step, then another. The room held its breath, and then, against all odds, Samuel let go of the bars. For a moment it seemed impossible. His tiny frame wavered, his arms stretched out, his body fighting gravity. But he stood, on his own. And then, with a determination far greater than his years, he took a step forward. Destiny gasped, tears spilling down her face. Matthew staggered forward, his knees nearly giving way beneath him, a sob tearing from his throat. Samuel took another step, and then another, until he collapsed straight into his father's arms. "Daddy," he whispered again, his voice soft but steady. Matthew clutched his son against his chest, weeping openly now, his entire body trembling as though the years of grief, control, and silence had all broken in that single instant. "You did it. Samuel, you did it," he choked, pressing his lips to his son's hair. Destiny turned away for a second, covering her mouth to stifle her sobs. The room around them blurred. For the first time since she had stepped into the Blake penthouse, she saw not wealth, not perfection, not icy walls, but a family reborn in front of her eyes. When Matthew finally looked up, his gaze locked onto Destiny. No words were spoken, but his eyes told her everything: gratitude, awe, and something deeper, something that had been buried under his fear for too long. She had not just helped Samuel walk. She had taught them all how to breathe again. Later that evening, as they flew back to New York, the city lights twinkling below like scattered stars, Matthew reached for Destiny's hand. It wasn't out of command or control. It was out of need, out of recognition, out of love. Destiny looked at him, tears still drying on her cheeks. Samuel slept between them, his head on her lap, his small body finally at peace. She squeezed Matthew's hand gently, her voice a whisper. "This is just the beginning." Matthew nodded, his eyes misted but full of quiet strength. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe it. And in the soft hum of the plane, in the steady rhythm of Samuel's breathing, in the warmth of destiny's touch, a shocking truth settled over him. The greatest miracle wasn't that his son had walked. It was that destiny had walked into their lives and changed them forever.